In 445 BC, inside the fortified citadel of Susa, a high-ranking Jewish official held a position at the very center of Persian imperial security. Nehemiah served as the royal cupbearer, a high-ranking officer entrusted with testing every cup of wine before it touched the king's lips. This crucial role required absolute personal loyalty, constant alertness, and total submission to the rigid protocols of the royal court. The royal cupbearer system operated as a vital human shield against political assassination and hidden poison inside the royal household. Holding this post meant standing mere steps away from supreme power every single day, carefully inspecting every drink, and maintaining an unblemished record of absolute reliability under the constant, watchful eyes of imperial guards. The daily protocol demanded total mechanical precision, where even a slight tremor of the hand or a sudden change in facial expression could trigger immediate suspicion of treason. Every flagon of wine was inspected, poured, and sampled before the assembled royal court, enforcing a strict discipline that left no room for personal error within the palace walls. Intelligence from distant provinces arrived continuously through official messengers, royal couriers, and traveling trade delegations. When Hanani, Nehemiah's brother, arrived from the southern Levant with a group of travelers, he delivered verified field reports describing the broken stone defenses, burned wooden gates, and severe distress of the remnant population living in Jerusalem. News of the city's fallen walls and charred gates struck Nehemiah with crushing emotional weight, placing his official standing in the court in immediate peril. In the presence of a sovereign who expected complete cheerfulness from all royal servants, displaying personal grief was a dangerous violation that could quickly lead to death or exile. Ancient Near Eastern monarchs viewed visible sadness among palace officials as a sign of treasonous dissatisfaction or hidden disloyalty toward royal authority. A mournful face before the throne implied criticism of the king's rule, drawing swift scrutiny from court guards and exposing the cupbearer to immediate mortal danger. For 4 long months, Nehemiah carried the silent agony of his homeland's ruin while performing his daily royal duties without a single visible error. The severe psychological strain of wearing a stoic, professional mask while grieving for his ancestors' city slowly drained his physical energy and tested his emotional resolve. The heavy internal pressure finally broke open during a formal court banquet in the month of Nisan, when his disciplined composure faltered for a single moment. The monarch immediately noticed the pale face and hollow eyes of his trusted servant, confronting him with a sudden and terrifying question about his altered appearance. The sovereign who issued that fateful inquiry was King Artaxerxes Longimanus, ruler of the vast Persian Empire stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. Standing directly before Artaxerxes, Nehemiah stood on the razor-thin edge between instant execution for royal disrespect and an extraordinary, unprecedented moment of opportunity. Before speaking a single word to the monarch, Nehemiah offered a quick, desperate prayer to the God of heaven, anchoring his heart during a moment of extreme personal peril. He then spoke with measured respect, explaining that his deep sorrow stemmed from the ruined condition of the city where his ancestors lay buried. The royal reception hall of Susa was a massive construct of soaring stone pillars, carved reliefs of winged bulls, and polished marble floors. Intricate tapestries hung between towering limestone columns, creating a dramatic visual contrast with the burned wood and fallen stones scattered across the desolate hills of Judah. Direct sunlight streamed through high clerestory windows, throwing sharp shadows across the elevated dais where Artaxerxes sat beside Queen Damaspia. The heavy scent of exotic incense filled the expansive air, emphasizing the immense gulf between imperial luxury and the desperate struggle of the survivors living in Jerusalem. The administrative machinery of the Persian court functioned through a complex network of satrapies, formal decrees, and provincial governors. Rebuilding a destroyed regional stronghold required explicit authorization from the central government, royal land grants, and clear security clearances to avoid triggering fears of provincial rebellion across the empire. Persian imperial policy strictly governed the construction of city walls to prevent local leaders from mounting insurrections against central authority. Any unauthorized attempt to rebuild urban fortifications was treated as an act of open treason against the crown. Bringing swift military intervention from regional garrison commanders stationed throughout the provinces. Nehemiah capitalized on the king's favor by presenting a clear, step-by-step administrative request rather than a vague personal plea. He requested official royal letters addressed to the governors of the provinces west of the Euphrates River, alongside a formal timber requisition order signed for Asaph, keeper of the king's forest. The imperial court approved the proposal, stamping the official documents with the king's signet ring and appointing Nehemiah as the royal governor of Judah. To guarantee safe passage through thousands of miles of hostile territory, Artaxerxes ordered a military detachment of cavalry and army officers to escort the expedition. The release of these royal decrees transformed a private sorrow into an official state initiative that altered the political balance of the western provinces. By authorizing the reconstruction of Jerusalem's defenses, the crown set off immediate alarm among local rulers who had long profited from Judah's economic and military weakness. This sudden shift in imperial policy laid the foundation for intense political tension and direct conflict across the Levant. With signed royal documents in hand and an armed escort at his side, the former cupbearer departed the capital of Susa, moving toward a ruined city and an unfolding struggle against hostile forces. The psychological weight of carrying imperial orders across thousands of miles pressed heavily on Nehemiah. Though he held written guarantees from Artaxerxes, royal seals could not grant inner peace or eliminate the silent dread of walking into an ambush. Every step away from the secure halls of Susa pushed him deeper into a vast, unpredictable frontier where distant laws held little sway over desperate men. The journey exposed the fragile reality of power within the Persian realm. On paper, the decree of the great king commanded absolute obedience, yet on the dusty trails of the western provinces, authority depended entirely on local enforcement. Nehemiah knew that regional rulers often acted with quiet defiance, knowing that news of treason took months to travel back to the palace, leaving him exposed to sudden betrayal before help could ever arrive. Leaving the royal highway behind, the expedition pushed west toward the elevated terrain of Judah. The transition was stark, moving from fertile imperial river basins into dusty, neglected valleys that had suffered decades of economic decay. Trade caravans moved cautiously along these routes, avoiding ruined settlements that offered no protection against bandits and hostile regional militias. As the sun sank below the western hills, the silhouette of Jerusalem finally appeared against the evening sky, From a distance, the ancient city looked less like a provincial capital and more like an abandoned hill fort, stripped of its former majesty and cut off from the vibrant trade networks of the Levant. Nehemiah entered through the broken gateway in silence, choosing not to announce his arrival or reveal the royal letters to the city elders. What he witnessed during those first quiet hours was a landscape of devastation. Centuries of military destruction and physical neglect had reduced the city defenses to scattered piles of rubble. Blackened limestone blocks, fractured by ancient fires, sat embedded in mounds of hardened ash, while thick briars grew over collapsed stairways and shattered terraces. In the deep ravines surrounding the hill, erosion had washed away entire sections of foundational masonry. Where grand city gates once stood, open gaps allowed cold winds to sweep across empty stone plazas. The silence of the ruins reflected a broken spirit among the surviving populace, who had grown accustomed to living without security, vulnerable to every passing raid. To rebuild such a place required more than physical labor. It demanded a complete structural assessment of what remained. Nehemiah understood that a defensive wall in the ancient world served as the backbone of civil society. Without solid stonework, a city could not regulate trade, collect taxes, or offer sanctuary to farmers during times of regional conflict. The total collapse of Jerusalem's perimeter meant that the surrounding governors operated with complete impunity inside Judah's borders. Local merchants were routinely forced to pay tribute to foreign warlords just to bring their goods to market. Restoring the stone ramparts was not merely a construction project, but a necessary reset of economic independence and local rule. Determined to learn the true extent of the ruin without triggering premature panic, Nehemiah mounted his horse under cover of dark. Accompanied by only a few trusted men on foot, he rode out through the valley gate toward the Dragon Well. The path was so choked with fallen debris and massive boulders that his mount could no longer push through the narrow tracks. Dismounting in the shadow of the valley, he surveyed every breach, measuring the gaps and calculating the sheer tonnage of stone needed to seal the gaps. He documented the condition of each structural section, from the eroded foundations near the fountain gate to the burned timber beams of the king's pool. Every detail was recorded in his mind before a single laborer was summoned. News of the governor's inspection quickly reached Sanballat the Horonite, the powerful ruler of Samaria to the north. Sanballat had long viewed the desolate condition of Jerusalem as essential to his own political dominance over the region. The prospect of a fortified, self-governing Jewish capital threatened his lucrative control over regional trade routes and imperial taxation. Sanballat responded swiftly, launching an aggressive campaign of political intimidation. He publicly questioned the legality of the project, framing the construction effort as a prelude to armed rebellion against the Persian king. By spreading these calculated rumors among neighboring provinces, he attempted to provoke imperial intervention and paralyze the project before the foundation stones could be reset. The psychological impact on the inhabitants of Jerusalem was immediate and crippling. Generations of living in insecurity had left the populace deeply traumatized, making them susceptible to fear and doubt. Mockery from foreign envoys echoed off the ruined stones, warning the workers that their fragile ramparts would collapse if even a small desert fox climbed upon them. Nehemiah recognized that demoralization posed a greater threat to the project than physical exhaustion. Rather than engaging in public shouting matches, he reoriented the people toward a shared purpose, reminding them of their heritage and duty. His steady demeanor transformed widespread anxiety into a quiet, collective determination to defend their ancestral home, regardless of the cost. The opposition soon deepened through the arrival of Tobiah the Ammonite, an influential official with deep familial ties inside Jerusalem itself. Unlike the overt hostility of Sanballat, Tobiah operated through social connections, political leverage, and economic partnerships with prominent Jewish families. His presence changed the nature of the conflict, introducing internal subversion into an already volatile environment. Tobiah used his network to gather intelligence on construction progress, feeding information to hostile neighbors, while attempting to undermine Nehemiah's standing among local leaders. Letters passed back and forth between Tobiah and key figures within the city walls, creating an atmosphere of suspicion where every administrative decision was questioned from within. The physical terrain surrounding Judah made early detection of threats remarkably difficult. The countryside was a maze of dry wadis, steep limestone ridges, and hidden caves that provided ideal cover for raiding parties loyal to Tobiah and Sanballat. Workers gathering timber in the surrounding forests were constantly exposed to sudden ambushes from roving bands of horsemen. On the exposed hillsides where stone quarrying took place, the heat was intense and water was scarce. Laborers worked under the blazing sun while maintaining constant watch on the horizon, knowing that attack could come from any direction. The harsh environment tested the physical endurance of the workforce, forcing Nehemiah to reevaluate the security measures needed to keep the project alive. To maintain momentum under constant external threat, Nehemiah focuses administrative efforts on an ingenious section-by-section assignment system across the ruined perimeter. Families, priests, and merchant guilds were placed directly in front of their own homes or workshops. This design ensured that every single worker possessed a personal, immediate stake in defending the precise section of wall they were actively assigned to rebuild. This organizational strategy focuses defensive priorities onto localized units, effectively turning household heads into military team leaders on the front lines. By directly aligning personal family survival with civic duty, the administrative framework eliminated operational confusion, reduced unnecessary travel across exposed terrain, and created an immediate sense of shared accountability among the returning exiles as they labored side by side. Construction protocols required precise stone cutting and traditional mortar mixing using local limestone, charcoal ash, and water drawn from deep subterranean cisterns. Skilled artisans used heavy iron chisels and weighted plumb lines to ensure that newly built stone sections aligned perfectly with surviving ancient foundations, carefully clearing centuries of charred rubble before laying down the heavy bottom courses of massive stone blocks. Every morning at dawn, team leaders methodically inspected their assigned sectors, logging fractured stones that needed immediate replacement and organizing dedicated haulers to clear dangerous fallen debris. Blacksmiths set up mobile charcoal forges along the inner perimeter, working non-stop to repair broken iron picks and sharpen heavy wooden scaffolding pegs necessary to support massive timber lintels over damaged city gates. The immediate result of this rapid structural reorganization was a dramatic acceleration in physical defense that caught neighboring regional governors completely off guard. As gap after gap along the broken perimeter closed, the cost of launching a direct military assault grew exceedingly high for opposing factions who had fully expected the rebuilding project to collapse under internal strain and exhaustion. Facing a rapidly fortifying Jerusalem, Sanballat and Tobiah were forced to alter their entire strategic posture, recognizing that simple physical intimidation was no longer sufficient. The high probability of heavy casualties in open conflict compelled the hostile alliance to abandon direct military confrontation and turn toward covert subversion, deceptive rumors, and psychological warfare to disrupt the work from within. For the exhausted builders, every standing timber and newly set stone brought an overwhelming mixture of profound relief and intense, lingering fear. They realized that while their physical security was improving hour by hour, the political tension hanging over the province had reached an all-time high, leaving everyone waiting in breathless anticipation for the inevitable counterstrike from regional enemies. Living under constant surveillance wore down the emotional reserves of families who slept in their working clothes with weapons resting directly by their sides. The heavy weight of uncertainty made every nighttime shadow look like an advancing enemy patrol, forcing men, women, and children to endure relentless psychological stress while rebuilding their ancestral home one stone at a time. As physical barriers rose around the city, the conflict shifted from a localized struggle over timber and stone to a high-stakes duel of political survival. The surrounding regional governors knew that a fully fortified Jerusalem would strip them of their regional influence, end their economic exploitation, and restore sovereign judicial authority to the Jewish leadership once and for all. This shift in political momentum redefined the ultimate stakes of the entire enterprise across the administrative structure of the Persian Empire. The wall was no longer merely a local construction project. It had become an unmistakable signal that regional authority was being permanently redistributed away from Samaria and Amman back toward the ancient capital of Jerusalem. Along the steep eastern slopes of the Kedron Valley, the harsh environmental conditions created severe hazards for construction crews working above the precipice. Loose gravel, sliding earth, and unstable ancient ruins slid down the steep limestone cliffs under the weight of heavy masonry, constantly threatening to drag workers into the deep ravine far below during excavation work. Choking dust clouds whipped up by dry mountain winds constantly coated the work site, blinding guards on wooden lookout towers and exhausting laborers hauling heavy limestone blocks up slippery stone paths. The exposed ridges offered no shade from the relentless midday heat, while freezing night winds swept through open breaches, punishing those assigned to nighttime guard duty. While Nehemiah had originally secured official imperial letters from Persian authority, the immediate reality on the ground required rapid tactical innovation to protect the workforce. He instituted a comprehensive split-shift rotation system, dividing the entire population so that one half worked on construction, while the other half stood fully armed with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. This tactical doctrine transformed the entire city into an active military garrison without halting the physical momentum of the reconstruction project for even a single day. Trumpeters were assigned to stay beside key administrative leaders at all times, instructed to sound a clear alarm call that would instantly concentrate dispersed defensive forces onto any sector under active threat. Under these strict security regulations, every builder held a trowel in one hand and a weapon in the other throughout the long 12-hour workday. Construction materials were transported on pack animals under armed escort, and no worker was permitted to remove their clothes or lay down their weapons, even when retrieving drinking water from distant subterranean cisterns. At night, laborers slept inside the city walls rather than returning to vulnerable outlying villages, establishing a continuous perimeter guard that secured the gates until daybreak. Watch posts were established at short intervals along completed sections, ensuring clear sight lines across outer valleys and preventing hostile infiltrators from scaling unfinished wooden scaffolding or unmonitored stone wall sections. Though King Artaxerxes had authorized the initial mission, the execution of defensive measures had to operate locally without waiting for distant imperial dispatches. The immediate consequence of these militarized shifts was total operational readiness that effectively neutralized every attempt by regional adversaries to launch a surprise attack against vulnerable construction sectors along the wall. By establishing total defense without violating royal decrees, the city maintained its legal standing while completely thwarting external military pressure. Hostile regional governors were left with no legitimate grounds to report open rebellion to the Persian court, leaving their conspiratorial plans frustrated and buying the precious time needed to seal the final remaining gaps in the wall. The psychological weight resting on Nehemiah went far beyond physical exhaustion or fear of ambush. In the silence of the night, he knew his entire commission rested on the fragile goodwill of a single man sitting hundreds of leagues away on a throne in Susa. King Artaxerxes had given his royal consent, but royal favor in the Persian court was notoriously fickle. A single whispering courtier or distorted report from regional governors could instantly turn a king's trust into a sentence of death. Every stone laid along the breached walls felt like a quiet defiance against the crushing weight of imperial authority. Nehemiah carried the perpetual dread that despite his legal authorization, the distant sovereign might reconsider the geopolitical wisdom of fortifying Jerusalem. To lead a demoralized people while carrying the secret terror of royal betrayal required an extraordinary internal resilience. The leader was forced to walk a razor-thin line between total submission to his monarch and absolute obedience to his divine calling. While King Artaxerxes remained distant in his winter palace, his imperial authority was the invisible bedrock upon which the entire reconstruction project depended. That royal sanction, recorded on rolled parchment and stamped with the royal signet, served as Nehemiah's only earthly shield against immediate military intervention by hostile neighbors. Yet written decrees were only as effective as the speed at which royal messengers could ride across the rugged satrapies of the empire. As construction reached critical height, Nehemiah could no longer rely solely on paper authorizations from Susa. He had to translate that distant legal permission into immediate, decisive action on the ground before political tides in the capital could shift against him. The vast world of the Persian court was defined by grand stone columns, polished marble pavements, and guarded gateways where access to the monarch was strictly guarded. In stark contrast to the dust and sweat of Jerusalem, the imperial center in Susa operated under meticulous ceremonial silence, where a king's nod brought wealth and his frown brought execution. Cold mountain winds blew through the outer courts of the palace, carrying dispatches from Syria, Egypt, and Babylon to royal scribes who recorded every transaction in imperial records. Across those hundreds of miles of arid wilderness lay the royal highway, a network of stone roads, guarded way stations, and exhausted couriers riding day and night. Along this barren corridor, news traveled back and forth between the seat of absolute power and the desperate windswept ruins of Judah. The sheer physical isolation of Jerusalem accentuated its vulnerability, situated at the fragile fringe of an empire where help was months away and danger stood right outside the gates. Though the Persian administrative apparatus was vast and organized, its governance relied heavily on local satraps and provincial governors who enjoyed sweeping regional autonomy. These governors collected taxes, maintained garrisons, and enforced order, often exploiting their independence to advance personal rivalries and expand their own political influence. Under this imperial structure, any attempt by a subordinate province to alter its physical infrastructure, especially by erecting defensive walls, triggered instant suspicion among neighboring rulers. Nehemiah understood that the Persian system allowed local governors like Sanballat to file formal grievances directly to the crown, framing local construction projects as covert preparations for tax evasion or open rebellion. To navigate this dangerous bureaucratic maze, Nehemiah made precise use of imperial supply channels authorized in his original royal requisition. He presented signed imperial mandates to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, demanding specific allocations of timber for the gates of the citadel, the city walls, and his own official residence. Every beam cut and transported was meticulously recorded, establishing a paper trail that proved all materials were acquired legally under royal warrant. Furthermore, Nehemiah utilized the imperial escort of cavalry captains and soldiers granted by the king to escort shipments through hostile territories beyond the river. By presenting royal passports to regional officials along the supply route, he forced hostile governors to honor the king's seal even while they plotted against the project in secret. This rigorous adherence to official Persian procedure created a legal safeguard that prevented his opponents from lawfully seizing construction supplies or arresting his workers. The broader consequence of this legal strategy was a delicate standoff between local conspirators and the unyielding framework of Persian law. Regional adversaries were completely paralyzed from launching an open military assault, because doing so would constitute direct treason against King Artaxerxes himself. By keeping every action strictly within the bounds of imperial law, Nehemiah turned the formidable machinery of the Persian Empire against its own corrupt provincial officers. The enemies of Jerusalem found themselves trapped by the very imperial bureaucracy they hoped to manipulate, unable to halt the rising wall without exposing their own insubordination to the crown. For the impoverished citizens rebuilding Jerusalem, living under the shadow of a colossal empire, created a persistent sense of helplessness. They were painfully aware that their safety, their taxes, and their very existence were subject to the whims of foreign rulers who viewed their sacred city merely as a minor tax district. That constant awareness of subjection weighed heavily on the workers as they hauled heavy stones up steep inclines under the scorching sun. They were not merely fighting physical fatigue. They were fighting the creeping despair that comes from centuries of occupation and foreign dominance. Nehemiah had to continually remind them that despite their political subjection to Persia, their ultimate loyalty and protection belonged to a far higher sovereign. Turning away from the political intrigue of distant courts, the immediate struggle remained firmly anchored in the shattered streets and broken stones of Jerusalem. The physical reality of the city demanded unrelenting focus, as every gap in the ancient masonry represented a direct invitation to disaster. Jerusalem was not merely a construction site. It was the spiritual heart of a scattered nation trying to reclaim its lost identity from rubble and ash. As the perimeter closed day by day, the physical rising of the walls began to transform the internal morale of the community from defeated survivors into a unified, resilient body. The topography of Jerusalem presented formidable natural and physical obstacles to the builders. Perched on a narrow ridge flanked by the steep Kidron and Hinnom valleys, the ancient ruins sloped precipitously down terraces, choked with centuries of scorched debris and collapsed stone blocks. Dust rose continuously from the excavation trenches, filling the dry air with the acrid smell of burnt limestone and dried mortar as workers cleared paths down to the bedrock. Along the eastern slopes, massive heaps of rubble made it impossible even for pack animals to pass, forcing laborers to clear tons of broken masonry by hand before foundations could be laid. Sun-baked timber frames were hauled into place at the valley gate and the fountain gate, while guards stood atop unfinished stone turrets scanning the jagged horizon. Beneath the relentless glare of the Judean sun, the city emerged step by step from a desolate heap of ruins into a formidable fortress. To ensure that every foot of the enclosure was fortified without gap or delay, Nehemiah established a decentralized defensive network that mapped directly onto the social hierarchy of the community. Rather than relying on a centralized military force, he assigned specific stretches of masonry to distinct clans, priesthoods, and trade guilds. Each head of a house was made directly responsible for restoring the wall immediately adjacent to his own dwelling, linking personal survival to civic duty. This spatial distribution created an interconnected web of accountability across the entire perimeter of the city. By assigning craftsmen, goldsmiths, and merchants to the gates nearest their private properties, the leadership ensured that no sector was left neglected or understaffed. If a single break in the line failed, it directly compromised the safety of the worker's own family, binding individual domestic interests to the collective preservation of Jerusalem. The technical execution of the reconstruction demanded rigorous standardization under severe material constraints. Laborers cut recycled limestone blocks into uniform shapes, using heavy iron hammers and chisels to square the edges before setting them with lime mortar. Heavy wooden lintels were treated with pitch to resist rot, fitted into socketed stone jambs, and secured with massive iron bolts forged on site in temporary ironworks. Water was drawn in continuous chains from the Gihon spring to keep the mortar mix at precise consistency under the scorching sun. Stonemasons used plumb lines and measuring reeds to maintain straight structural axes along steep slopes where seismic activity and previous destructions had left shifting bedrock. To accelerate progress, work crews operated on overlapping shifts that kept mortar moving and hammers ringing from the break of dawn until the stars appeared. When Sanballat observed the rapid closure of the structural gaps across the northern ramparts, his strategy shifted from mockery to active military posture. Recognizing that verbal intimidation had failed to halt the work, the Samaritan governor began assembling allied forces along the border, seeking to provoke a confrontation that would force Persian imperial inspectors to intervene. The regional governor calculated that if he could incite open skirmishes around Jerusalem, he could frame the Jewish building project as an illegal rebellion against the crown. Armed patrols from Samaria and neighboring provinces began conducting provocative maneuvers within sight of the northern watchtowers, testing the resolve of the perimeter guards and attempting to cut off incoming supply wagons carrying timber and stone. The constant threat of violent incursions created an environment of acute distress among the civilian workforce. Families working along the exposed northern face lived under the perpetual fear that an unexpected assault could sweep over their low parapets at any hour. The psychological burden of handling heavy stone while constantly scanning the horizon for enemy banners eroded the morale of even the most devoted laborers. Sleep became elusive for the residents as false alarms repeatedly sounded through the narrow streets during the night. Mothers kept their children close within the inner courtyards while men lay down with their weapons beside them, unsure whether the dawn would bring continued construction or open warfare. This lingering dread threatened to crush the spirit of the people far more effectively than physical exhaustion ever could. Seeing that armed posturing had not halted the rising stones, Tobiah the Ammonite initiated a subtle campaign of political subversion inside Jerusalem's walls. He recognized that where external force met immovable resolve, internal deception could exploit existing economic and social fault lines. Tobiah began exploiting his extensive familial connections with prominent aristocratic houses in Judah to create a quiet rift within the leadership. Through strategic correspondence and clandestine alliances, he sought to weaken Nehemiah's authority from within, turning respected local elders into advocates for foreign interests under the guise of diplomatic compromise. Inside the stone chambers of Jerusalem's noble estates, a suffocating atmosphere of secrecy and mistrust began to take hold. Scroll tubes bearing Tobiah's seal arrived under cover of darkness, passed from hand to hand among influential families who owed him financial debts or held marital ties to his house. Whispers filled the private courtyards, disputing the governor's decisions and questioning the necessity of such radical separation from neighboring provinces. The public markets became places of quiet suspicion, where neighbors evaluated each other's loyalties by the company they kept and the news they shared. Tense silences fell over group discussions whenever Nehemiah's officers approached, while private letters praising Tobiah's generosity were read behind closed doors. This covert web of influence created an invisible battleground within the very city the walls were built to protect. To counter this dual threat of external ambush and internal betrayal, Nehemiah restructured the entire mobilization strategy into a synchronized dual-purpose operation. He mandated that the entire population be split into two distinct operational components that function simultaneously without interrupting the primary objective. One half of the men continued the physical restoration of the masonry, while the other half stood fully armed behind them with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. Every mason at the wall worked with a sword girded at his side, transforming the construction site into an active defensive military line that could pivot instantly from labor to combat. A centralized rapid response protocol was established to overcome the physical distance separating workers along the long, winding perimeter. A dedicated hornblower was assigned to remain continuously at Nehemiah's side as he inspected the various sectors of the project. If a section of the wall came under attack, the horn would sound a distinct emergency call, signaling all surrounding units to abandon their trowels and converge immediately on that position. Tactical discipline was strictly enforced, requiring all personnel, including leaders and guards, to remain fully clothed and armed even during off-duty hours. Water collection and personal routines were conducted with weapons in hand, ensuring that the garrison could react within seconds to any night assault or surprise raid without losing precious momentum. This total integration of defense and construction rendered the regional governor's military ambitions entirely ineffective before a single arrow was fired. When Sanballat and Tobiah realized that Jerusalem had transformed into a hardened, vigilant war footing capable of immediate resistance, their window for a surprise strike closed permanently. The high-stakes gamble of maintaining total mobilization paid off as the momentum shifted decisively in favor of the builders. The hostile foreign coalitions were forced to retreat into passive observation, leaving Jerusalem's leaders in full control of the regional narrative and paving the way for the historic completion of the city's defenses. The emotional toll of relentless vigilance weighed heavily upon every family living inside the half-rebuilt fortifications of Jerusalem. months of sleeping fully clothed in dust-covered garments, clutching spears through freezing desert nights, and laboring past midnight had pushed the populace to the edge of utter physical and mental collapse. Men and women stood beside crumbling ramparts with calloused, bleeding hands, carrying a deep psychological exhaustion that far exceeded the weight of heavy stone cutting. Beneath this overwhelming strain, a quiet desperation settled over the stonecutters, carpenters, and city guards. They had built under constant threat of sudden ambush, but the emotional cost of surviving on perpetual high alert was slowly eroding their collective spirit. Every unexpected sound echoing from the surrounding dry ravines sent waves of dread through the workforce, proving that the silent psychological burden was far more crushing than the physical tasks. Yet just as the physical threat of armed invasion began to subside, a far more dangerous crisis emerged from within the city walls. The stakes shifted rapidly from military survival against foreign foes to an urgent internal struggle against domestic economic decay, mounting debt, and the heartbreaking practice of impoverished parents selling their children into servitude. Without securing the economic and moral foundation of the people living inside, the newly restored defenses would remain nothing more than an empty, vulnerable shell. The governor was forced to confront a sobering reality where the ultimate threat to Jerusalem's future came not from surrounding provincial armies, but from internal economic corruption that threatened to tear the community apart from within. Outside the newly hung timber gates, the surrounding Judean countryside lay sun-baked and barren, stripped of timber for scaffolding and battered by long seasonal droughts. Terraced hillsides that had once produced rich harvests of wheat, figs, and olive oil were left neglected or mortgaged, leaving dust-choked dirt trails winding past emptied stone granaries, silent wine presses, and crumbling watchtowers. Cold desert winds swept through the desolate valleys, kicking up clouds of fine, pale dust across the parched landscape. Inside the stone perimeter, makeshift shelters constructed from black goat hair and scrap timber leaned against ancient stone ruins, housing displaced farming families who had abandoned their fields to join the construction effort. Thin wisps of smoke rose from sparse cooking fires in the harsh morning sunlight, highlighting the grim reality of poverty beneath the towering ramparts. It was an environment defined by severe scarcity, where exorbitant grain prices threatened to starve the laborers defending the walls. To halt this catastrophic domestic collapse, Nehemiah instituted a radical restructuring of local governance that completely overturned decades of systemic financial exploitation. Previous governors appointed by regional powers had burdened the population with crushing tax levies, demanding 40 shekels of silver daily alongside food and wine, while allowing wealthy local elites to seize ancestral lands. Nehemiah systematically dismantled this predatory system by waiving his governor allowance and establishing an unyielding standard of personal integrity. His administrative policy forced wealthy nobles, civic leaders, and regional officials to immediately cancel all outstanding debts, return seized vineyards and olive groves, and halt the practice of charging ruinous interest. By grounding his governance in personal financial sacrifice rather than official royal privilege, he constructed a unified civic framework capable of withstanding both internal dissent and external hostility. The operational logistics of this government reform were recorded with precise administrative detail. Every day, Nehemiah provided lavish meals at his personal table for 150 Jewish leaders and visiting foreign envoys, serving 1 ox, 6 prime sheep, and abundant poultry alongside fresh wine every 10 days. These massive daily provisions were funded entirely from his private fortune, without levying a single coin in local taxes upon the population. Furthermore, he summoned a formal public assembly where wealthy creditors were confronted directly with legal records of their exploitative practices. Debt contracts were formally revoked, ancestral property titles were restored to original landowners, and Nehemiah dramatically shook out the folds of his robe, declaring that anyone who broke this pledge would be shaken out of their house and property in similar fashion. This decisive internal reform produced immediate diplomatic consequences across the administrative hierarchy of the Persian Empire. By restoring economic stability and preventing a widespread peasant revolt in Judah, Nehemiah protected imperial tax interests without generating a single complaint of mismanaged royal revenue or civil unrest among local satraps. The internal peace achieved in Jerusalem reassured royal officials in Susa that the newly fortified city posed no threat of insurrection against the crown. Instead of draining imperial resources through military intervention, the restored district became a stable, self-sustaining anchor along the empire's strategically vital Mediterranean trade routes and western borderlands. For the leader himself, maintaining this delicate balance between imperial oversight and local reform created a profound sense of personal isolation. Standing continuously between the absolute demands of a monarch and the spiritual needs of an impoverished populace required unceasing vigilance, emotional discipline, and lonely midnight prayers on the rooftop overlooking the sleeping city. Every administrative order carried the implicit danger of royal disfavor, knowing that foreign spies observed his movements and wrote secret reports to the court. The mental weight of leadership meant enduring constant anxiety, navigating treacherous political waters while refusing to compromise the sacred mission entrusted to his care by God and king alike. As internal unity was restored, the focus of external hostility shifted back toward high-level imperial politics. Foreign adversaries, led by Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, who had failed to halt construction through military intimidation, now organized a covert political campaign designed to alienate King Artaxerxes from his former cupbearer. Distorted reports and unsealed letters were drafted for immediate delivery to the Persian royal court, claiming that the newly completed wall was merely a prelude to declaring a new king in Jerusalem. The stage was set for a dangerous diplomatic showdown, where rumor and false accusations became weapons of political destruction. Over 800 miles to the east, in the grand royal complex of Susa, towering limestone columns capped with carved bull capitals lined vast marble courtyards decorated with colorful glazed brick reliefs. Inside the silent cavernous reception halls of the palace, imperial scribes recorded official dispatches from distant satrapies under the watchful eyes of high-ranking Persian ministers. Thick incense drifted through cold, shadow-draped corridors where courtiers endlessly plotted for royal favor, creating an environment dripping with paranoia and palace intrigue. It was into this insular, dangerous realm that the forged letters from Judea were directed, bearing calculated accusations designed to provoke a swift military response and sign Nehemiah's death warrant. The Persian imperial legal system was built upon an unyielding network of official record-keeping, where every formal accusation brought against a provincial governor was systematically logged in royal registries. In this vast administrative machine, an unsealed letter carrying allegations of rebellion was not merely local gossip. It became a matter of state record that demanded formal review by imperial chancelleries. Under Persian governance, regional satraps maintained absolute oversight over taxation and loyalty within their territories, creating a rigid balance of power designed to suppress any sign of sedition. When charges of treason were officially logged, imperial investigators were deployed to examine provincial expenditures, fortifications, and troop movements to ensure absolute compliance with the king's original decrees. The formal procedure for handling charges against provincial officers required cross-referencing new dispatches with archived royal letters stored in the treasuries of Ecbatana and Babylon. Scribes meticulously reviewed the original decrees issued by King Artaxerxes in the spring of 445 BC to verify whether the timber allocations and border passages granted to Nehemiah authorized physical fortification or merely civil administration. Royal couriers traveling along the royal road operated under strict time limits, carrying official inquiries from regional governors directly to the king's inner council. If a report contained specific allegations of royal usurpation, imperial protocol mandated an immediate audit of local taxes and a temporary suspension of all ongoing public works until royal clearance was granted. The potential fallout of an imperial treason investigation extended far beyond the immediate governors involved, threatening to destabilize the delicate peace across the entire fifth satrapy. A single royal order from Susa could mobilize provincial garrisons from Syria, Samaria, and Phoenicia to descend upon Judah, grinding the fragile restoration effort to a violent halt. For the Persian crown, regional stability was paramount, and any governor suspected of harboring messianic ambitions or raising unauthorized armies faced swift execution. Nehemiah understood that a political trial in Susa would not only end his governorship, but could result in the total destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersal of its vulnerable population. The psychological weight on Nehemiah was immense as he stood in the shadow of potential imperial wrath, fully aware that his personal favor with King Artaxerxes could vanish in an instant. Every shadow on the wall seemed to carry the threat of royal betrayal, forcing him to carry the agonizing burden of a leader who stood between his people and the total fury of an empire. Among the citizens of Jerusalem, news of the hostile letters spread a chilling wave of anxiety through every neighborhood, shaking the fragile confidence they had built over months of tireless labor. Families who had risked everything to rebuild their ancestral homes now lived in constant dread of seeing Persian cavalry cresting the surrounding hills to dismantle their work. While conspiracy and legal maneuvering reached across the vast distances to Susa, the immediate battle for survival remained anchored within the rugged terrain of Jerusalem. Nehemiah recognized that no matter what transpired in distant palace courts, the physical safety of his people depended entirely on their readiness behind the stone ramparts. Shifting his attention from international diplomacy to local defense, the governor turned to address the immediate operational crisis inside the city walls. The threat of an external military strike demanded an absolute overhaul of daily life, transforming a community of exhausted builders into a disciplined, watchful garrison. Inside the newly enclosed perimeter of Jerusalem, a heavy and tense quiet hung over the narrow limestone streets and dusty public squares. Dense morning fog rolled across the Kidron Valley, wrapping the jagged stone towers in gray dampness, while watchmen paced the narrow parapets, peering through the gloom for signs of enemy movement. Along the newly elevated ramparts, piles of roughly hewn stones, wooden timber supports, and stacks of iron-tipped spears lined the wall walks behind the crenellations. The city, once an open ruin vulnerable to every roving band of raiders, had transformed into a stark stone fortress carved out of the rocky hilltop landscape. The completed wall operated as a comprehensive security apparatus, functioning not merely as a passive barrier, but as an organized system of controlled access and continuous surveillance. Gatehouses were engineered with double wooden doors reinforced with heavy iron bands, requiring dedicated teams of porters to manage entry points and verify the credentials of every entrant. To maintain complete control over the perimeter, Nehemiah established a systematic guard rotation that divided the city wall into distinct security sectors assigned to specific families and priestly guilds. This structural organization ensured that every section of masonry was under constant observation, creating a unified defensive web capable of responding instantly to breach attempts. Defensive protocols dictated that half of the labor force remained actively building, while the other half stood armed with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. Construction workers kept their weapons strapped to their sides while lifting heavy limestone blocks, and mortar layers worked with trowels in one hand and spears gripped firmly in the other. A centralized communication procedure was established using a dedicated trumpeter who remained continuously at Nehemiah's side as he inspected the defenses. Because the work was vast and spread across miles of steep terrain, the blast of the ram's horn served as the absolute signal for all scattered defenders to rally immediately to the point of alarm. The successful implementation of this rigorous military posture completely neutralized Sanballat's hopes for a surprise armed assault on the unfortified city. Watching from the hills of Samaria, the rival governor saw his military advantage evaporate, forcing him to abandon open warfare in favor of more insidious, personal traps. Realizing that the physical wall could no longer be broken by force, Sanballat shifted his strategy toward direct psychological warfare aimed personally at Nehemiah. His failure on the battlefield drove him to construct elaborate schemes of deceptive meetings and false prophetic warnings designed to trick Nehemiah into committing a fatal act of cowardice. For Sanballat, the physical completion of the outer masonry was an unbearable humiliation that stripped away his political dominance over the region. The governor of Samaria had staked his entire official authority on the belief that Jerusalem's inhabitants were too broken, impoverished, and divided to repair their ancient defenses. Seeing the continuous stone barrier rise above the limestone ridges of Judah transformed his initial public mockery into an intense, desperate fury that consumed his military council inside the provincial capital. Inside the newly enclosed city, Nehemiah bore the suffocating psychological weight of this mounting hostility, fully aware that Sanballat's public embarrassment made him far more dangerous. The Persian cupbearer turned governor was forced to live in a state of unending vigil, sleeping in his official garments with his sword at his side while sifting through endless intelligence reports of covert plots. Every darkened alley along the city perimeter harbored the immediate threat of a knife in the dark or a sudden breach engineered by mercenary forces. While Sanballat posed an explicit external threat, an even more insidious plot was quietly taking root within the city walls through the shadow network controlled by Tobiah the Ammonite. Tobiah did not rely on military deployments or loud public threats, choosing instead to exploit extensive intermarriages and deep commercial ties with Jerusalem's wealthy aristocracy. This covert web of influence transformed the battle for Jerusalem from a straightforward defense of stone walls into a dangerous war of political subversion. Nehemiah recognized with chilling clarity that guarding the outer gates against foreign soldiers was entirely useless if the city's own priests and nobles were secretly sending letters of allegiance to their primary adversary. The dark stone corridors of the temple complex and the expansive courtyards of Jerusalem's noble estates served as quiet, operational centers for this treasonous flow of information. Beneath quiet archways and within private dining halls, secret couriers moved regularly under the cover of twilight, carrying sworn pacts, political intelligence, and financial ledgers across the Jordan River directly to Tobiah's estate. Even as the formidable stone ramparts rose high against the Judean sky, the atmosphere inside the capital remained heavy with distrust and unspoken betrayal. The very administrative chambers, designed to serve as a sacred refuge for the returned exiles, were compromised by secret agreements, binding prominent Judean families to an outside adversary who sought their ruin. To dismantle this internal subversion, Nehemiah established a systematic counterintelligence framework across every sector of the capital city. He instituted a strict verification protocol, requiring documented family genealogies and formal loyalty oaths before allowing any citizen or noble access to municipal councils or sacred temple storerooms. Furthermore, he structured a highly disciplined administrative rotation, ensuring that gatekeepers, singers, and Levites were assigned to security posts in paired teams to prevent single points of bribery or betrayal. This structured operational focus systematically choked off Tobiah's secret communication lines, securing the city's internal administration against covert infiltration. With the internal intelligence network compromised and neutralized, Nehemiah moved to execute the final technical phase of the fortification project, hanging the massive timber gates. Skilled craftsmen fitted heavy oak beams into stone sockets carved directly into the ancient masonry, reinforcing the massive wooden panels with hand-forged iron plates, thick metal studs, and heavy crossbars. He established uncompromising security regulations for these crucial entryways, commanding that the city gates remain shut and locked throughout the night, and never opened until the heat of the sun was high in the sky. Guard stations were strategically positioned directly at each portal, with local citizens assigned to watch posts facing their own family homes to guarantee absolute personal investment in every shift. The final dropping of the heavy wooden crossbars and iron bolts into their sockets marked a monumental historical turning point for Jerusalem in 445 BC. After 52 days of exhausting, uninterrupted labor carried out under constant threat of armed attack, the wall was fully closed, turning an open ash heap into an unassailable mountain fortress. This technical and strategic triumph sent immediate shockwaves through the surrounding Persian satrapies, dramatically resetting the balance of power across the entire Levant. Neighboring governors who had exploited Jerusalem's undefended state for over a century were suddenly forced to reckon with an intimidating stronghold commanded by an uncompromising imperial governor. A profound wave of emotional relief and sacred gratitude swept across the exhausted labor force as they gathered atop the towering wall walks. Men who had spent nearly 2 months working with mortar trowels in one hand and iron spears in the other looked out over the unbroken perimeter, weeping tears of joy at the miraculous restoration of their ancestral city. Conversely, a suffocating sense of psychological defeat fell upon the surrounding hostile nations who had conspired to burn the city to the ground. Recognizing that the completion of such a massive engineering project in just 52 days could only be explained by divine providence, their arrogance collapsed into silent dread and demoralizing shame. Yet Nehemiah understood that majestic stone walls were merely an external shield, completely worthless without moral integrity and civic order among the people dwelling inside. With the physical defenses permanently established, the weight of his leadership immediately shifted from military construction to the far more delicate task of social and spiritual renewal. The long-term survival of the Jewish state now depended on transforming a scattered, impoverished population into a united, law-abiding community. To achieve this, Nehemiah initiated a comprehensive national census to organize the clans, clarify property inheritances, and prepare the entire population for a solemn covenant renewal. Under the crisp autumn sky, the broad stone plaza situated before the water gate was cleared of construction debris and prepared for a massive national assembly. The imposing, newly finished walls rose high in the background, casting long shadows across thousands of men, women, and children who stood packed tightly into the open square in profound silence. Where charred rubble, broken stones, and wild vegetation had choked the hill of Zion just months before, there now stood a secure, orderly, and fortified sanctuary, ready to receive the sacred law. The physical restoration of Jerusalem was finished, establishing a majestic historical backdrop for the spiritual awakening that would reshape the future of the nation. When Nehemiah first stood before King Artaxerxes in 445 BC, his petition addressed an immediate crisis, but the governance system he established in Judah outlasted the initial emergency. The governor understood that stone walls were ineffective without municipal administration. He organized Jerusalem into distinct civic sectors, assigning specific family clans to oversee security and maintenance along designated wall sections, transforming a vulnerable sanctuary into an efficient provincial capital. This administrative framework extended to economic stabilization. Nehemiah eliminated the predatory interest rates that had driven impoverished farmers into debt slavery and forced families to mortgage their ancestral lands. By regulating marketplace transactions and establishing public grain reserves, he restored financial stability. These economic reforms renewed public trust in local governance, enabling Jerusalem to function as a self-sustaining municipal hub within the Persian imperial system. To ensure the long-term viability of the capital, a systematic repopulation policy was enacted by official decree. Historical records document that Jerusalem remained dangerously underpopulated, with insufficient residents to defend the perimeter. The leadership implemented a sacred lot casting system, mandating that 1 out of every 10 Jewish families in rural towns permanently relocate into the urban center to garrison the gates and staff public offices. The mechanics of this resettlement required precise legal procedures. Local courts recorded land titles, resolved territorial disputes between incoming settlers and existing residents, and reallocated abandoned urban plots. Relocated families received residential allocations within designated city quarters while retaining rights to their ancestral farmlands outside the walls. This dual residence procedure provided the city with a stable tax base without disrupting regional agricultural production. The enforcement of this relocation policy permanently altered the socio-political landscape of Judah. Rural settlements previously operating as isolated agrarian pockets were now directly linked to the centralized authority in Jerusalem. Hostile regional leaders like Sanballat of Samaria lost their political leverage as a unified, repopulated capital shifted the balance of power along Mediterranean trade routes and established Judea as an autonomous administrative entity. This structural consolidation also secured the financial independence of the Second Temple. By instituting a mandatory half-shekel annual temple tax collected through verified civic records, the leadership guaranteed a reliable revenue stream for daily operations and maintenance. The sacred sanctuary was no longer reliant on arbitrary royal grants or vulnerable to economic blockades imposed by hostile neighbors like Tobiah the Ammonite. Behind these successful legal decrees lay the quiet sacrifices of families forced to abandon their rural routines. Relocating into a scarred urban landscape required parents to dismantle established households and uproot children from familiar fields. Families chosen by lot faced the daunting task of rebuilding lives amid stone ruins and the constant anxiety of future conflicts, carrying a heavy personal burden for the public good. The records show that the community responded with remarkable civic devotion, publicly honoring those who voluntarily relocated to Jerusalem alongside those chosen by lot. Citizens remaining in the countryside pledged portions of their harvests to support their urban kin, forging a resilient bond of mutual reliance. This shared burden transformed a compulsory decree into a collective movement that united scattered clans. The completion and repopulation of Jerusalem sent immediate shockwaves through the Persian provincial administration. Royal inspectors evaluating regional security documented that the southwestern border corridor was now anchored by a fortified loyal city. Imperial planners abandoned the assumption that Judea was a defenseless buffer zone, integrating the secure capital into Persian strategic planning along the critical highway to Egypt. Neighboring provincial leaders were forced to adjust their diplomatic strategies accordingly. Governors who had long treated Judea as a weak vassal state now confronted an autonomous provincial administration protected by royal decrees and fortified ramparts. The hostile coalition led by Sanballat collapsed as trade shifted toward Jerusalem's market square, compelling surrounding territories to seek formal commercial agreements with the restored capital. Despite these monumental achievements, historical records leave one critical question unresolved regarding Nehemiah's tenure. After 12 years of leadership, the governor returned to the Persian royal court in 433 BC to fulfill his pledge to Artaxerxes. During his absence, the rigorous reforms he instituted began to unravel, leaving scholars to debate whether this decline resulted from structural flaws or persistent corruption among local elites. Archaeological evidence from the city reveals a complex picture of this transitional period. Storage chambers near the temple gates show signs of misuse, while foreign administrative seals reappear in archaeological layers dating to Nehemiah's absence. The historical record cannot fully explain how Tobiah secured a private room inside the sacred temple precinct, highlighting the corruption that resurfaced once firm executive oversight was removed. Upon returning for his second term, Nehemiah recognized that administrative decrees required continuous enforcement. He immediately expelled Tobiah's possessions from the temple precinct and purified the sacred rooms. To prevent future abuses, Nehemiah established an independent oversight commission of trusted scribes and priests to audit temple inventories, institutionalizing accountability to protect public resources during transitions of power. Nehemiah also enacted strict measures to enforce Sabbath compliance within the city walls. He ordered the massive wooden gates of Jerusalem locked at sundown every Friday evening, placing trusted guards at every entry point to prevent foreign merchants from conducting trade. Traders who camped outside attempting illegal commerce were banished, establishing clear boundaries that preserved civic and spiritual identity. These operational controls directly reshaped daily life for Jerusalem's residents and visiting merchants. Every Friday afternoon, as sunset approached, trumpets sounded from the city towers to signal the closing of the gates, prompting merchants to clear the plazas. The noise of international commerce yielded to quiet family gatherings, establishing a structured weekly rhythm that restored stability to the population. For working families, these procedural guardrails provided vital protection against economic exploitation. Small landowners were no longer subjected to predatory weekend trading schemes by wealthy nobles, allowing agrarian families to safeguard their inheritance. The restoration of public order gave citizens tangible security, ensuring that the immense effort invested in rebuilding the city delivered lasting benefits for future generations. On a broader geopolitical scale, The permanent stabilization of Jerusalem established a new precedent for provincial administration within the Persian Empire. Imperial authorities recognized that permitting subject nations to maintain their traditional laws under loyal local governance fostered greater stability than military force. This governance model demonstrated that localized administrative autonomy could coexist successfully with imperial allegiance. The enduring legacy of this era extended far beyond 5th century BC Judea. By defending their physical city and restoring their covenant identity against overwhelming odds, the people of Jerusalem laid the institutional foundation that preserved their national existence through future imperial conquests. The stone walls Nehemiah raised from ashes became a lasting sanctuary, safeguarding traditions that would shape human history. Yet despite the detailed memoirs recorded in biblical history, one unsettling question lingers in the silence of antiquity. The historical record falls completely silent regarding Nehemiah's final days, leaving scholars unable to determine whether he returned to the Persian court in Susa or died among the people he fought so hard to protect. This missing chapter leaves a poignant void at the end of a life spent entirely in service to an ideal, leaving his final quiet moments veiled forever in history. The total absence of personal letters or administrative notes from his remaining years creates a quiet ache in the historical narrative. A leader who carried the overwhelming psychological burden of an entire nation's physical and spiritual survival simply fades from public memory without a monument or recorded burial site. That silence serves as a stark reminder that true dedication often requires submitting personal glory to the survival of a cause greater than oneself. Shifting away from the mystery of his personal ending, the physical and administrative reality he constructed remained firmly anchored in the Judean hills. The structural transformation of Jerusalem served as a decisive pivot point, shifting the community from a vulnerable provincial outpost into a resilient, self-governing administrative center. This transformation established an enduring legal framework that protected the population against foreign encroachment for generations to come. This durable institutional shift carried profound consequences throughout the ancient Near East. By securing imperial recognition for local Sabbath observance and economic protections, the community established a precedent for religious autonomy within multi-ethnic empires. The political maneuverings in Persian courtrooms laid a permanent foundation, proving that spiritual devotion and practical governance could unite to ensure the survival of a displaced people. Inside the newly secured stone perimeter, the rhythm of daily life took on a quiet, peaceful atmosphere. Sunlight illuminated limestone streets where merchants displayed goods without fear of sudden raids, and families gathered near domestic cisterns built beside ancient masonry. The towering stone battlements provided a protective shield, casting long shadows across repaved plazas where children played near restored gates that had once burned in ruin. Beyond the defensive walls, the surrounding countryside bore the calm markers of renewed agrarian stability. Terraced vineyards climbed steep hillsides once abandoned to wild brambles, while grain threshing floors operated routinely along quiet valley floors. The cool mountain breeze swept past reinforced masonry, carrying the quiet sounds of domestic life through an urban landscape that had finally recovered its security and dignity. From an administrative standpoint, this successful reconstruction fundamentally altered how imperial authorities managed provincial border regions. By permitting local governors to enforce traditional civic codes while maintaining strict tax allegiances, the Persian imperial administration discovered an effective model for securing restless frontier territories. This governance framework demonstrated that respecting local identity could yield greater regional stability than continuous military occupation. The systemic impact of this administrative balance echoed across subsequent centuries of Near Eastern history. When foreign empires later swept across the region, the fortified physical sanctuary and solidified legal identity enabled the Judean population to preserve their sacred texts and distinct culture. The structural defense system became an indispensable shield, protecting a fragile heritage against powerful cultural assimilation. On a procedural level, historians still grapple with how Persian royal treasury ledgers accounted for the substantial tax exemptions granted during the Reconstruction period. Royal administrative documents from Susa record provincial tax receipts across Syria-Palestine, yet specific ledgers detailing local timber allocations and tax write-offs for Jerusalem remain lost. This missing administrative documentation leaves precise financial calculations of the royal subsidy beyond modern verification. Imperial record-keeping protocols of the 5th century BC typically documented royal clearances through cuneiform tablets and papyrus rolls stored in central archives. However, the exact administrative process by which local governors filed emergency tax relief requests remains uncertain due to selective record preservation. This gap in bureaucratic documentation leaves open questions about how provincial governors negotiated complex financial dispensations directly with the imperial crown. The tangible outcome of these historical events was the creation of a durable civic and spiritual refuge centered upon the Second Temple. By securing the physical city against regional rivals, the local leadership established a permanent institutional anchor that endured through the rise and fall of surrounding empires. This fortified sanctuary ensured that small agrarian communities could maintain their distinct covenant identity without fear of immediate dissolution. This lasting institutional stability had far-reaching historical implications for the preservation of scripture and tradition. The secure urban center provided a safe environment where sacred texts could be copied, organized, and taught to future generations without interruption. Without this physical and legal protection, the spiritual heritage that shaped human civilization might have been scattered and lost among the shifting currents of ancient history. For the thousands of ordinary families who labored under scorching suns and guarded cold ramparts by night, the restored city represented far more than defensive masonry. It offered a quiet restoration of human dignity, providing a place where their children could grow in safety and where ancient promises felt real once again. Their quiet endurance transformed ruined rubble into a living home, proving that faith and labor could overcome the greatest hardships. Today, high above the quiet valleys, ancient stone blocks laid thousands of years ago still catch the warm light of the setting sun, standing as silent witnesses to a community that rebuilt their world from ashes.